What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
My parents didn't even bother to text me on my birthday, and that single moment, as simple as it might sound to anyone who hasn't lived through years of being treated like the extra piece in their own family, was the breaking point that I didn't know I had been slowly walking toward for most of my life, because up until then I always found ways to excuse them, to tell myself they were just busy, or distracted, or maybe not great with emotional gestures. But when you're their daughter and the day comes around once a year that literally marks the fact you exist, and they can't even send 2 seconds of a text message, you can't help but realize that the excuses you've been building like a dam around your feelings have finally cracked wide open. To understand how heavy that silence felt, you need to know that my younger brother Daniel was never treated the same way, not even remotely close, because in my parents' eyes he was always the golden child, the boy who could do no wrong. The one whose mistakes were brushed off as growing pains, while mine were held against me as evidence that I wasn't grateful enough, smart enough, or aligned enough with what they expected their daughter to be, and I think I carried that imbalance for so long that I convinced myself it was normal, like every family had someone who shined brighter while the other just accepted the shadows. Growing up, every birthday of Daniel's was an event, with balloons, cake, relatives being called, neighbors sometimes invited, and expensive gifts he didn't even appreciate half the time. Yet he received them with the kind of smugness only someone who has never known hunger for attention can show. Meanwhile, my birthdays usually slipped by with something practical, like socks or maybe a small gift card, and even then it was often accompanied by a reminder of how money doesn't grow on trees, or how I should be thankful because other kids don't even get that. Still, despite all the years of being treated like a background character in my own family, I held on to this naive belief that adulthood would change things, that maybe once we all had grown up and responsibilities were heavier, my parents would see me not as the girl they could easily dismiss, but as an equal adult, worthy of a phone call, a little recognition, or at the very least a text to say, "Happy birthday, we're thinking of you." But this year, nothing came. I woke up, scrolled through my phone, and as friends and coworkers reached out, I kept glancing at the notifications, expecting their names to pop up, waiting for that tiny bit of acknowledgement. Hours passed. By evening, I had fully realized it wasn't coming. They had completely forgotten, or worse, they had remembered and just decided not to care enough to even hit send. I remember sitting in my apartment that night, the kind of quiet that feels heavy in your chest surrounding me, and I kept thinking about every single time I had gone out of my way for them, every visit, every holiday, every effort to stay connected. And suddenly the truth hit me in a way it never had before. I mattered less to them than the effort it takes to type out 2 words on a phone. That's when I knew I couldn't keep pretending the relationship was balanced, because it wasn't, and the scales had never once tipped in my favor. What made it worse, what turned that pain into something much darker, was what happened 2 weeks later. I got a call from a cousin who, with an excited tone, told me she had been invited to a surprise party my parents threw for Daniel. Not only did they remember his birthday, they went so far as to make it an unforgettable spectacle, the kind of celebration you'd expect for someone winning the lottery, not for someone just turning another year older. At the party, in front of relatives, they handed him the keys to a brand new house. An actual house. Paid for, decorated, and presented with speeches about how proud they were of him, about how he deserved a real start in life, about how he was the future of our family. I couldn't even process it at first, because my mind was still stuck on the image of my own birthday 2 weeks before, when not only did they fail to give me a gift, not only did they fail to call, but they couldn't even extend the bare minimum courtesy of a text message, and now here they were buying a house for my brother, celebrating him like he was royalty. Do you know how humiliating it feels when your parents announce to everyone that one child is worth investing in for the future while the other child doesn't even warrant a phone notification? I don't think I've ever felt so invisible and enraged at the same time. I didn't go to that party, of course. I didn't even respond when I heard about it. But I sat in silence for a long time after, staring at the wall, and something inside me shifted. For years, I had been holding out this tiny hope that if I just worked harder, stayed longer in contact, showed up more, gave them more of myself, Maybe they would see me as someone worth loving equally. But that night, I knew that hope had been pathetic. I saw the situation for what it was. They were never going to change, and I was always going to be the child who got less, the afterthought, the one they would only notice if I disappeared completely. And that's when the thought crept in, clear and sharp. Maybe it was time to vanish from their lives, not in anger, not in some dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet way that finally showed them what it felt like to lose something they had taken for granted. That night, with my phone silent and my anger simmering into something colder, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being their backup plan, their second best, their invisible daughter. If they couldn't bother to acknowledge me on the one day that was entirely mine, then I was going to take back every piece of myself I had been offering them, and I was going to disappear in a way they could never predict, leaving them to scramble and panic while I finally tasted the freedom of living life on my own terms. The morning after I realized that my birthday had passed without so much as a lazy two-word text from the two people who raised me, I sat at my kitchen table and decided that if I was going to stop being the family's reliable background character, then I had to treat my own exit like a real plan and not a tantrum, which meant no dramatic posts, no pleading voicemail, no last chance coffee meeting where I tried to explain feelings to people who had spent years showing me they did not care, and instead a calm list of steps that would separate my life from theirs so completely that, for the first time, every choice I made would not require their approval, their money, or their constant judgment disguised as advice. I started with the things they used to keep a grip on me, the easy hooks that look harmless until you notice how tight they hold. So I called my cell provider and moved my line off the family plan they loved to remind me they paid for. I ported the number to a new account in my name. I set up a quiet voice message that says nothing personal and gives no hint of where I am if you are not already on my contact list, and then I turned off location sharing everywhere. Because I knew if they felt entitled to my day, they certainly felt entitled to my location, and I wasn't going to give them either. From there I did the boring but powerful things that make a real difference when you are serious about boundaries, because the truth is that in families like mine the control is hidden in paperwork and defaults. So I sent forms to my doctor and my dentist marking my records as private with a passcode under my authority only. I asked that no appointment details or bills be shared with anyone. I changed my emergency contacts at work to my friend Maya and my manager. I froze my credit with all 3 bureaus because I have seen parents like mine open accounts or sign phones to keep an adult child in the family system under the excuse of convenience, and I opened a checking account at a small credit union, moved my savings, and routed my direct deposit in a way that meant there were no statements going to the old address, and no joint anything left to be used as leverage when guilt did not work. I rented a private mailbox at a shipping store and listed it as my mailing address with every company that mattered, not because I was running from the law or anything dramatic like that, but because I wanted one clean channel that they could not intercept, scan, or use as a reason to show up. And then I went through my email and created filters that sent their messages to an archive I did not check, not because I needed them out of sight, but because I needed to train myself not to jump every time they typed my name. The first few days were shaky because any change that big makes your body expect the backlash long before it arrives, and I could almost feel the texts I knew would come, the guilt-laced lines about how I was being ungrateful, the warnings about family being forever, the classic mention of everything they had done for me, as if a roof and food cancel out years of favoritism and casual cruelty. Yet for the first time I let those thoughts pass without responding to them, because I was busy doing something they never expected me to do, which was building a life that did not have a door with their key in it. I cleaned up my social media without making a scene. I removed old photos that always turned into ammunition during arguments. I set everything to private. And I quietly messaged the few relatives who actually cared about me to say I was taking a break from family events and that I was okay, but unavailable. No explanations offered, no timeline given, and to my surprise the people who truly respected me simply said they were here if I needed them, and then did not push for details. What I did next is the part that some people will say sounds cold, but it was the cleanest way to stop the usual cycle where I act as their unpaid fixer. So I went through my calendar and removed myself from every standing favor I had agreed to. I canceled the recurring reminders to pick up prescriptions for my mother that somehow became my job even when my brother had a car and free afternoons. I emailed the church volunteer coordinator, who always called me first when my parents needed help with an event, and I told her I was not available for family tasks and that she should contact them directly. And then I called the property manager for the duplex where they rent a small unit for an aunt, and I removed my phone number from the emergency contact list, because if they wanted the power of being in charge, then they could also have the responsibility. And in that simple sequence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, which was the quiet dignity of not being used. I did not announce these changes to my parents. I did not explain or defend them. I simply made them, and I let the silence do the talking they never listened to anyway. Of course, the silence did not last, because people like my parents do not notice you until you stop serving a function, and then your absence becomes an emergency. So within a week the calls began, first from my mother's number and then from my father's. And when I did not pick up the phone, they tried my work line, then my manager, then my friend from college they barely know, and when that did not work, my mother sent a long message to a family group chat about how she was worried sick and how I had suddenly changed, which made a few cousins reach out to me with sympathetic notes, and I told each of them, kindly but clearly, that I was safe, I was taking space, and that anything my parents needed to discuss could be handled by email, which I knew they hated because email leaves a record, and records make it harder to twist facts later. That was small revenge, maybe, but it was also a precise move, because I wanted any conversation to live where I could prove exactly what was said. And when? The real revenge of this episode, the one that made me breathe a little easier, was the moment I logged out of the old shared cloud album where my mother curated our lives like a catalog, and I created a new private folder for myself labeled with a simple word that they would never see, which was boundaries. And inside it I saved screenshots of every text where they had dismissed me, belittled me, or compared me to Daniel, not because I wanted to weaponize the past, but because I wanted a mirror I could look at on weekdays when nostalgia tries to lie. And I added one more thing to that folder, a quiet little tripwire that I built by setting up a public email address that looks like mine but is not. One that forwards to an archive whenever someone searches for me and guesses at it, so I would know exactly when they started trying to track me down and which relatives they pulled into the effort. And when the first forward hit that archive late on a Sunday from an address I recognized as my father's friend at the club, I understood that the circus was about to begin, and I will admit that I closed my laptop with a small, tired smile, because for once I was not the one dancing in it. The first hint that my parents had shifted from passive-aggressive silence to full-blown panic was the forward from the decoy address I set up, the one that quietly collects guesses and searches people make when they think they are one clever step from tracking me down. Because the sender was not even a relative, but one of my father's club buddies who has never asked me a single thing about my life and suddenly wanted to confirm whether I was still working at the same place, which told me more than any voicemail ever could. And from there the pattern bloomed in that predictable way where every bad habit gets dressed up as concern, with calls to my old coworkers, awkward messages to two friends I had not spoken to since college, and a scattered round of sentimental posts from my mother about how she misses her daughter and just wants to hear her voice, which would have landed very differently if she had not also spent the last few years telling me that I was selfish, dramatic, and never satisfied. And I will admit that reading those public posts felt like watching someone leave flowers at a grave they helped dig while pretending they barely knew the shovel. I had promised myself that I would not engage in public drama, because performance is their home turf and I was done letting them drag me onto that stage. So I stayed quiet and I watched which relatives took the bait and which ones stayed out of it. And then I did something that might sound cold, but was absolutely necessary if I wanted the truth to stand on its feet for once, which was to send a calm, factual email to a small list of family members who had reached out to me. Nothing emotional. or explosive, just a timeline that started with the birthday they ignored and ended with the house keys they handed to my brother, with a handful of screenshots attached that showed the pattern of messages where my mother told me I was making everything about myself and my father wrote that Daniel deserved more because he will carry the family name. And I asked them not to reply unless they could keep the conversation respectful and private because I wanted a record, not a fight, and then I closed the laptop and let the information do what the truth usually does when you finally stop protecting the people who twist it. The fallout was immediate in small, telling ways, because the cousins who had been parroting my mother's posts suddenly went quiet. An aunt sent me a single-line note saying she understood, and that she was here if I needed anything. And my father's buddy at the club stopped playing detective after my manager declined to confirm anything and instead sent him a polite statement about company policy, which I had anticipated because I had already told my manager to route any family inquiries to HR and to document them carefully, and while none of that is fireworks, it is the kind of slow-burn accountability that leaves people like my parents scrambling to regain the narrative, which they tried to do by escalating in exactly the way I knew they would, with my mother calling every person who ever had my phone number and my father leaving this stern message about how family business should not be aired like laundry, as if they had not already strung it up across the neighborhood with those public posts about their missing daughter. Since I do not believe in letting people rewrite the script mid-play, I used the leverage I had built quietly over the years and executed the first real move that felt like revenge without the poison, which was to forward, selectively and with context, two of the most revealing text threads to the exact relatives they had used as messengers, not with insults or commentary, just with one sentence at the top that said, "This is why I stepped back. Please do not be part of the search," and the effect was instant, because the calls from those relatives stopped, the group chat chilled, and my mother's next post shifted from saintly worry to vague irritation about private matters being misunderstood, which told me she had realized the room was no longer clapping, and I will not lie, that felt good in a deep, clean way, because it was not about humiliating her, it was about removing the mask she wears when she wants sympathy more than she wants truth. They did not quit, of course, because my parents have always believed that pressure solves everything, so my father tried the classic threat disguised as concern when he left a message that said if I did not call back they would consider a wellness check, which would have embarrassed me at work and given them a fresh audience for their performance, and because I had a feeling they would go there I had already prepared a simple, boring counter, which was to call the non-emergency line in my area, confirm that I was safe and not in danger, and leave a note on file with my name and mailing address so that if anyone tried to weaponize the police as a stage prop the officers would have the other half of the story before knocking on my door. And while it felt strange to make that call, it also felt like fastening a seatbelt before my parents started driving the car into a wall and insisting I was the reckless one. The second move, which I kept even quieter, was to file a small change with a professional license registry that had my old address, and then watch as my father, clearly working his contacts, scraped the registry and started sending letters to that outdated location that never reached me, and when those letters were inevitably returned to sender I knew exactly what dinner conversation would sound like at their house. Lots of righteous frustration about how ungrateful I am and how difficult I am making things, never a breath spent on how easy it would have been to send a birthday text like any normal parent does without a script or a spotlight. And I realized in that moment that the circus they were building was mostly meant to keep them from looking into the mirror I had placed in the middle of the ring. By the end of that week the pressure shifted to my brother, because of course it did, and he started calling from a new number that I did not recognize, then texting that he was the rational one, and that I needed to stop embarrassing our parents and come over to talk like an adult, and while part of me wanted to unload everything I had been holding since childhood right onto his doorstep, I held back, because I was saving the conversation with Daniel for the moment it would actually change the game, and as his messages stacked up with that same casual entitlement that has always been his native language, I wrote one reply that said, "Email only." Then I opened the folder labeled Boundaries and I pulled up one last screenshot that I had never shared with anyone, The one where my mother told me that if a child has to earn love, then maybe she should work harder, and I knew exactly where to send it next. Which is why when Daniel finally called again and I picked up, I had already lined up the next move that would make the search grind to a halt and turn the spotlight exactly where it belonged. When Daniel finally called and I decided to pick up, I did it with the kind of calm that only shows up when you have already accepted that you do not need anything from the person on the other end. So I let him run through his practiced mixture of authority and fake brotherly concern about how I was scaring our parents, about how I was making them look bad, about how I should stop the drama and come over to talk like adults. And I let him talk until the shape of the story he was telling was clear, because beneath the polished phrases and the predictable guilt he dropped the truth in pieces without noticing, admitting that they knew they had missed my birthday and that they were going to make it up to me later. Admitting that the house had been in the works for months and that it was a reward for being the stable one. Admitting that our parents believed I was too emotional to appreciate big gestures. And once I had that string of confessions sitting quietly between us, I told him that I wanted everything he just said in writing so there would be no misunderstandings, which is the kind of sentence that usually makes people who love control shift in their seat. And he did exactly that before snapping that I was turning into an outsider who hated her own family. Then he hung up, and within an hour an email arrived that read exactly like his call, neat and condescending and accidentally honest. I have learned that when people rely on performance to hold power, they're allergic to records, because records make memory too solid to bend, so I printed that email. I attached it to the small packet I had been assembling with the texts where my mother told me love should be earned and the message where my father insisted that Daniel deserved more because he would carry the name. And I sent that packet privately to the handful of relatives who had been pulled into the search, with one line at the top asking them not to contact me again about reconciliations until the behavior that led to the break had been acknowledged in writing by the people who caused it, and then I CC'd 2 people who mattered to my parents more than they should, which were the chair of the committee my mother lives for and the neighbor who runs the homeowners association where they like to shine. Not because I wanted a public spectacle, but because my parents had already chosen an audience, and I chose a different one that actually keeps receipts. The reaction was instant in that quiet, effective way that tells you a pressure point has been found, because my cousin stopped relaying messages. My aunt replied that she was stepping back until things were resolved respectfully. The committee chair sent a bland note to my mother about process and damage control, and the homeowners association neighbor asked my father to keep family matters out of the neighborhood channels, and for the first time in a very long time I watched my parents lose access to their favorite stage while realizing I had not raised my voice once, which is the only kind of revenge that feels clean, the kind that points at the truth and lets the truth be heavy all by itself. Daniel reacted the way I expected when his email began to circulate privately among the very people he assumed would back him, because he called back with heat in his voice and said I was humiliating him, that I was dragging outsiders into private issues, that I was ungrateful and petty. And I told him in the same even tone that if he did not want outsiders involved, he could stop recruiting them to search for me, that if our parents wanted privacy, they could stop posting about their missing daughter while ignoring the missing respect that created the silence. And then I gave him a simple choice, which was to send a new email acknowledging what he had written and offering a direct apology without excuses or spin. Posted in the same family group my mother used when she needed an audience, and I said that if he could do that, we could talk about what repair looks like, but if he could not, then he and our parents should prepare to live with the boundaries I had built, and he said some ugly things that he will pretend he did not say later, and then he hung up again. I do not throw bricks when a scalpel will do, so while they flailed I used a smaller, sharper tool and reversed one of their favorite tricks, the one where reputation is currency and whispers are debt. By sending a short message to the church volunteer coordinator who has spent years watching my mother dominate signups and stories, telling her that my inbox would no longer handle any logistics for them and that any mention of me being unreachable should be balanced with the note that I had asked for written apologies, and was otherwise fine and employed and not in danger, which sounds trivial until you remember that in communities like there's the person who controls the practical details, controls the narrative. And by closing that door gently, I move the story one step closer to the only version I can live with, the one where I am not a villain for stepping out of a play I never agreed to be in. Because I believe in making consequences land exactly where they belong, I also took back two invisible supports my parents have leaned on for years without naming them. First, by canceling the auto-renew I had been quietly paying on a cloud storage plan that my mother filled with our lives and treated like a scrapbook of her triumphs, leaving her to either downsize or pay for it herself. And second, by transferring the small music and streaming accounts I created for family events to my personal email, and then removing everyone from the member list, which meant when my mother tried to host a gathering to spin the story back into her favor, she discovered that the conveniences she had treated like oxygen were not magic after all, they were me. And I was not there to carry them anymore. The best part of this episode for me was not any of those logistics, though they mattered. It was the moment I set a single condition that forced them to make a choice between their image and our truth, which I wrote in an email so it would live in the record where spin goes to die, saying that I would consider a mediated conversation only after a written apology from both of them acknowledging the birthday silence and the house spectacle and the years of unequal treatment, posted to the same family thread where they had recruited sympathy and search parties, and that until that happened, every attempt to find me, message me through third parties, or threaten me with wellness checks would be forwarded to an attorney who would handle all communication going forward. And then I clicked send and I put my phone face down, and I listened to the quiet that comes when you stop begging for respect and start requiring it. They did not apologize, and that was their right, but they did exactly what I expected next, which was to escalate by calling a cousin with enough free time and enough appetite for drama to deliver a rant on their behalf. And when that cousin texted me one of those paragraphs stuffed with guilt and script and warnings about family ties, I forwarded my condition again with the attachments, and I added one line that said the next message they receive about me will arrive by certified mail and will not be a request, it will be a notice, and I mean this without theater or threats. Just as a person who learned the hard way that sometimes you stop waiting for people to value you, and instead you build a life so solid they have to either meet you at the truth or get used to talking to your lawyer. And as soon as I sent it, I knew exactly what I would do the next morning, because there was one move left that would cut through the noise and make everything very simple. By the time the noise from my parents' campaign had reached its loudest point, with the constant circling of phone calls, the guilt-heavy letters that kept bouncing back because they still insisted on sending them to my old address, the staged Facebook posts where my mother played the part of the grieving parent whose only crime was loving too much, and the endless whispers running through relatives who were tired of being used as messengers, but too polite to cut them off, I had reached the place where exhaustion turns into clarity, the place where you no longer debate whether you deserve peace, but simply decide that peace will be the baseline from now on, whether anyone else approves or not. And with that clarity, I made the last move I had been holding back, the one that would close the circle and leave them with no more angles to exploit. I contacted a lawyer, not because I was preparing for a legal fight, but because I wanted to put a clean professional layer between me and the circus they were staging. And I asked him to act as my mailing address of record for any future family communication, which meant that from that moment forward my parents would never again have a direct line to me unless I chose to give it. And anything they wanted to say would first pass through a person whose job was to filter, document, and send it on, in a way that left no room for gaslighting or revision. When he agreed, I drafted a single-page letter for him to deliver, polite but cold, with no apologies, no softness, just the plain statement that I no longer wished for personal contact, that all communication must go through his office. And attached to that letter was a copy of a donation receipt made in my name to a housing charity, a donation that matched the approximate value of the house they had given Daniel, and in the memo line I had written, in honor of every child whose parents told them they were less. The genius of that move was not in the money, because I did not come from wealth, and giving that sum away was not easy. It was in the symbolism, because my parents had chosen to announce to the world that Daniel was the child worth investing in, the one worth securing a future for, and I had chosen to announce just as publicly, though in a different way, that I would rather give that level of value to complete strangers than to continue begging my own family for scraps of recognition. And once that receipt was delivered through legal channels, it traveled quickly through the social circles my parents cared about most, because the lawyer mailed copies not only to them, but also to the handful of relatives who had been roped into the search. And soon enough, the story was not about the ungrateful daughter who disappeared. It was about the daughter who had made a massive charitable donation while her parents publicly wept about losing control of the narrative. The silence that followed was louder than any confrontation could have been, because I knew exactly what it meant. They were embarrassed, furious, scrambling to explain how the child they had dismissed as dramatic and selfish had managed to flip the story so thoroughly that their social circle now saw her as generous, independent, and principled. While they looked like parents who could not even remember a birthday, but somehow had the funds and energy to hand a house to their golden boy. Daniel tried once more to call, his voice caught between anger and desperation, saying that I was trying to ruin him, that people at work were asking questions about whether he really deserved that house, that I had gone too far. And all I said was that I had given them one condition, a written acknowledgement of the truth, and they had refused. So I had made my own acknowledgement in a way that could not be spun, and I ended the call before he could spit out another insult. The finality of it all hit me in waves, because cutting ties with your family is not a single clean cut. It is a series of decisions that feel impossible until you finally make them. And then the ground underneath you shifts and you realize you can actually stand taller without the weight of begging for something that was never going to be given freely. My lawyer confirmed that since the letter was delivered, there had been no new attempts at direct contact, only a few stiff notes sent to his office, notes that he filed without forwarding, because they contained no acknowledgement, no apology, only more theater. And that was exactly what I expected, because my parents were never going to bend to truth when lies had served them so comfortably for decades. Some people might say that donating the value of that house was petty or dramatic, but the truth is that it was the cleanest revenge I could imagine, because it stripped away their favorite weapon, which was the ability to decide who looked like the good child and who looked like the failure, and instead of leaving me bitter and invisible, it left them facing the fact that I had built my own version of worth without their approval. For the first time, I did not need them to recognize me, because the world already had in a way they could never undo, and the only people left embarrassed were the ones who had set the stage in the first place. I do not know if I will ever speak to them again, and I will not pretend there are not nights where the quiet feels sharp, but I know this. I stopped being their backup character. I stopped playing the role of the daughter who should be grateful for crumbs, and I forced them to sit in the silence they created, a silence that echoes far louder than any words I could throw at them. Sometimes the smartest revenge is not the loudest fight, but the final withdrawal, the refusal to keep auditioning for love that should have been automatic. And when I think about the ridiculous ways they tried to find me, the staged posts, the desperate calls, the attempts to turn relatives into detectives, I almost laugh, because they never realized that the one person who had been hardest to find all along was not me. It was the version of themselves that could admit the truth without an audience clapping. That is how I know I won, not because I shouted louder, not because I broke them with cruelty, but because I walked away. I left them scrambling in a play with no supporting cast, and I built a life where their approval is no longer the prize, where silence is my final word, and where the freedom I claimed is louder than anything they will ever say about me again.